Patreon for the public internet. And maybe we can start digging into Weiser. I was inspired to reread this paper due to Apple's recent announcement, but I found it pretty enjoyable just to think about again. It's been some years since I thought about it, and naturally, when one returns to something like that, one finds oneself with a lot of new ideas. So first, I guess just to get us rolling, I'll ask, what do you find most and least compelling about this vision?
I think what I personally find most compelling is that as someone who gets very distracted incredibly easily, I hate whenever a piece of technology or really anything like distracts me. So I like the idea of it just being invisible and just there when I want it or actually need it, rather than constantly bombarding me with notifications. Like, sometimes, like a good example of like the notification thing, right, is like on my iPhone I have a CVS app which I use for prescription refills, and then which is very useful and very helpful and makes my life easier. And then sometimes it will always bombard me with notifications I can never quite seem to turn off about the new offer of the day, which I really don't want, right? So just like, I don't know, just getting out of my way, like as just like a tenet of computing sounds great.
Let me push you on that a little bit, because I agree, it sounds great. One thing is, like, he doesn't exactly point at. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but Weiser went on with John Seely Brown to advocate for kind of a vision of computing called calm technology, and that there's calmtech.com or org,
Yeah.
whole manifesto. And in this essay, he only sort of alludes to that. He doesn't really actually say, like, what is it about this technology that would make it not get in your way and not be like that CVS app. In his scenario, I think there are notifications in that scenario. Do you have thoughts on, like, if this ubiquitous technology, like the pads and the tabs, if those existed, like, what would have to be true?
Yeah, I guess I just, from a purely imaginative standpoint, like when I, reading that paper and seeing all the, other things people have thought about alongside that, I guess I just sort of I don't know, maybe just took it as a presumption, which may be wrong, of being more in control of the things, being able to summon it when I want it, rather than it being in the background and then popping out like a ghost and then going away.
Yeah, I think you're right that he there are like vague references to that, and maybe we can look to the text and find we can ground this in the text. So I mean, I found kind of a clear example, like in the narrative scenario. There's on page 7, a blank tab on Sal's desk beeps and displays the word Joe on it. Is on the right column. In the center, he picks it up and gestures with words are live board. It's kind of like a phone call. Does he have anything to say about the way that these technologies should make themselves salient to us, or should interact with our attention?
This is quite high level, but he does have this memorable image of a walk in the woods, and as a contrast to the typical experience of using computers and information overload. So clearly that's sort of part of his motivation or his vision with this kind of system. But I don't know if the paper goes into much detail about, why should a system of devices spread out through your environment make for a calmer experience than just a single box.
It's interesting that on the second page, in the third paragraph, he says, embodied virtuality will make individuals more aware of the people on the other ends of their computer links. And that, again, introduces some ambivalence. That's almost pulling in the opposite direction of what you're mentioning. It's a little bit like maybe trying to do some work in the common thing where like it's you're very aware of the people around you perhaps as opposed to in a live. So. I'm pulling on this just to point out that this seems to be both like a strength of the vision, that it's kind of gesturing at this naturalistic like walk in the woods kind of vibe, but seems to actually be lacking details, some of which he may have filled in later in the context stuff. Anybody else like a strength or an observed limitation?
I had a thought on the last point first. This is where Apple Vision Pro's decision to add physical cues to the environment kind of came up. It seems almost like a transitory feature that we want there to be some like presence of our technology, and without the shadows of the screen, we'll run into a wall or something. I think that was part of the decision making, but yeah, adoption. Like the question that came up to me is, which is what drives adoption of new paradigms in human-computer interface, and how much of it is following natural human behavior versus creating new behavior. Like in hindsight, touch screens and search engines seem to follow some natural human behavior, like convenience or speed. I want a question answered, easy interface to get it answered. But I personally, for example, held on to my iPhone 8 for a long time because I didn't want to lose the button. That was really important to me. And now that it's been a couple of years switch, I don't really look back. But yeah, I am just curious about the core question about technology disappearing and how important that really is, especially as someone who works less on the building of the technology side, more on getting people to use and adopt the technology. The early waves of new technology directly leverage the technology and the branding. And crypto, like you have the DAO in the company name, and AI, you have GPT as in the name of the core product driving adoption. So maybe early on, the early adopters need to like see the technology in your face to use it, but I don't know if you can completely get away from it.
One of my questions was going to be, and this ties in kind of well, what technologies, if any, have become invisible since this was written in 1991?
That's a good question.
Like
First,
like fully
go ahead.
invisible in all forms, or in some forms effectively invisible, but like
We could talk
I
about
definitely
both.
feel like I
He is
oh,
an
go ahead.
axis, right?
What's that?
He sketches a sort of spectrum, I guess.
Well,
Yeah,
the concept of it is, I was just going to say, the concept of invisibility here is kind of ambiguous, because I feel like the model are things like maybe even something like language, like language is just threaded through our world, and in some sense it becomes invisible, but in another sense it's absolutely not invisible. It's extremely salient and important, but it's something about how, I don't know, the means becomes less visible. Like you don't have to go through a whole cognitive process of, oh, I'm looking at words now, let me do the words thing. It's just kind of something automatic. But I don't know, the word invisibility seems in some ways inapt.
The first thing that came to my mind was just, and a gut reaction was GPS, right? It's sort of something that we all have around now. It's not something we ever think about, like, oh boy, let me pull out my GPS device. It's just a thing that's baked into it, and we can use all these tools and services that can access it. But we never think, oh boy, is the GPS going to work today? It's like, no, we just take that for granted.
Some of the properties of what he seems to be gesturing at include things like automaticity. So like a property of language is that usually when we're using it, we're not thinking very hard about using it. Cost, he talks about the cost of things being driven down to nothing. Like language doesn't really cost us anything. And his vision of his pads are that they're, like scratch paper. Likewise, like ubiquitous availability, like paper's available basically everywhere, but like a spare laptop is kind of not.
So I mean, access to the internet, I think, is very close to being in this category. That it used to be like, oh, I guess I'm going to use the internet now. Nobody's going to be able to use my house phone for the next few hours or whatever.
1991 would have been the first year of the World Wide Web.
Yeah. So, but now, certainly for people living in most cities and whatnot, we just kind of assume that we're always going to have access to all these forms of communication and information retrieval.
I would say wirelessly also. So it's kind of clear from his descriptions of some of the technical implementations is that like wireless connectivity and wireless networking is still like a very baroque and somewhat like consternation inducing kind of proposition. RFID everywhere.
Yeah, NFC,
This
Bluetooth.
may be a
What was-
boring one, but like even like mathematical calculations, like, they're definitely so correct all of the time that it's easy to not have to think at all.
Yeah. Increasingly complex ones too. Like now not have a 4-function calculator, but we have Wolfram Alpha.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember being a kid in grade school and, hearing teachers say, well, you're never going to carry a calculator around with you everywhere. And we're very wrong about that.
Right.
I carry that calculator with me everywhere.
And it gives rise to certain things. I mean, the ubiquity in particular of GPS and wireless connectivity relates to an example I gave in my Vision Pro notes of the interactive map system available on this thing as being kind of one of the applications that's almost most purely kind of built for this form. It is about where you are. It has the GPS, and you're walking around. You don't have a wire connection. You're constantly getting this information about your surroundings. It's always up to date. It's not like an atlas that's downloaded to your phone sometime long ago. And of course, all of this is parlayed into your wireless communications. So you're coordinating a trip in a foreign country with 8 friends, and this is like eminently tractable.
On that vein, messaging also.
Yeah.
I think it's you don't think about how do I contact this person on the other side of the world. It's up mostly cheap or free, and basically anyone over the world can do it now.
Or even just long distance calls in general, right? Like,
Yes.
it would cost extra money to, call a cousin who lived in Virginia when I lived in Ohio.
Right.
I was born in India, and for a complicated reason, I was left in India. My parents had to go to America without me for 6 years. Every week, I had one 30-minute window where I could talk to my parents when we had enough reception in like 91 to 95.
Wow.
And like sometimes like the service would break. So it was like that 30-minute window. And now we FaceTime our family in India every week.
Let me ask, what are some things that are importantly missing or deficient in this vision? If Weiser got like exactly his way as described in this paper, why might we be unhappy or satisfied?
Well, but I feel like we aren't quite living in a world that really seems like the vision described in the paper, which gets into, among other things, this question about what does ubiquity mean and what's the form of ubiquity? Because we all feel like we have access to these capabilities of communication and information retrieval because we all are carrying phones in our pockets. And Weiser very explicitly says, oh, if you have to carry some special device with you everywhere you go, that's not ubiquitous computing. So he's more interested in something that's threaded through the environment.
Right.
So I guess the question would be, is that actually essential for getting at the ends that he's interested in, or is that just a like an accident of his short-term vision.
So one way in which it seems essential that still really bothers me. This is not an answer to the question that I asked a moment ago, but to something to what you just said, is so we're still all stuck in the tiny black rectangles all the time, and when I'm doing like when I'm working on a manuscript, I want to have lots of papers open in front of me on my desk, and I wish that I had like 25 iPads or something like that. That's still not really tractable. So that is a way in which like just carrying this around is like it's not quite adequate. Carrying my iPad around is not quite adequate. It's precious.
I don't remember offhand. I read this paper a year ago or so, and I'm not sure if I remember. But there's a set of kind of dynamic land arguments about the benefits of broad visibility and having many people sharing in a whole environment that's allows you to structure information. I don't know if this paper really posits those motivations as much.
Yeah, but they're weak. So especially in the closing section, maybe we can look at this a minute and talk about the difference between dynamic lands vision and Weiser's, because it's substantially overlapping but incompletely. So in the fourth full paragraph of the second to last page, he writes, "Even today, people holed up in offices before glowing computer screens may not see their fellows for the better part of each day. In virtual reality, the outside world and all its inhabitants effectively cease to exist. Ubiquitous computers, in contrast, reside in the human world and pose no barrier to personal interactions." It's not quite as sharp as what you're gesturing at, but it does seem to be gesturing at that. I don't see him explicitly say. Sorry to interrupt. I don't see him explicitly say anywhere that, like someone else coming into Sal's office in this narrative and like seeing what he's working out another gender. Instead, we have an intrusion in the form of a telepresence. We have Joe, the telepresence, coming into Sal's office, and then they're talking about another colleague who's not present. And then there's this discussion of Sal keeps miniature versions of all of Joe's tabs and pads in view on their desk, which is this kind of interesting like spatial sameness, but it's really not the dynamic land thing.
Yeah, I was looking to see how differently like the means of displaying would be in comparison to dynamic land or vision or something. But it still seems like all of like the tabs, pads, and boards are still flat land. Anything that you would depict would just be flat. Even if they can be like attached to physical objects and stuff, you're still kind of at the whim of like what you can like materially assemble. And I don't see an aspiration towards that. There were some moments earlier when he talks about like being able to like simulate like galactic gravitational forces or like different like microscopic phenomena. But it did seem like a very the aspiration for these technologies to sort of efface themselves and become like so ubiquitous that it does seem almost to like trap it in the mundane, or it seemed very intentional that the story that was told is just a normal day's work with normal experiences and nothing exotic.
I wonder if it would have seemed so normal and non-exotic to a 1991 reader.
True.
Is your sense of... Oh, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I kept having to remind myself of the date when I would read the paper. But related thought on what both of you mentioned, he has at points very interesting design philosophy. Imagine if the computer knew what room it was in. And for me, I interpreted that to mean the kind of things I would want to do on my computer in this office room versus in like a living room versus, a different room. The kind of activities or behaviors I would care about and or restrict myself from. And then when he got to the application, the example I had bolded was she wants to know when her colleague is doing, like, kind of passively with the tabbed windows. And I was like, would she really if she was at home? I know when I'm like, I think in practice, and this is kind of jumping to, I guess, today, there was the implosion of remote work technology around the pandemic, and the startup that kind of started that was called Tandem, and they did presence indicators. And so I found it interesting that in this paper, the presence indicator is like the person switching between tabs, and in Tandem, it's like someone being online. And Tandem ultimately didn't work, and the founder wrote an interesting kind of postmortem about it that's worth reading. And the core conclusion is people value we didn't find a venture skill market because most people value the autonomy of remote work more than they miss the quick syncs and high-paced collaboration of in-office work. So like in reality, they didn't really want that. They were at home, so they just wanted to simulate being at home, which is not getting all these notifications of Nick being online and Gray ready to chat. So it kind of died out after the pandemic. So yeah, I agree with the point of there are a lot of interesting design philosophy, but I think in the implementation, there's more to be imagined. But yeah, it might have been impressive in 91.
There's also this sort of optimism in the last section on the final page, in the first paragraph with a big B, where they're saying that embodied virtuality will make individuals more aware of the people on the other ends of their computer links. I wasn't incredibly convinced by this, or it doesn't seem necessary that would happen. And I'm wondering if y'all noticed any other evidence for that. Is it just because you would be seeing them depicted, and that would make you more aware that they're people? I guess
we don't actually have anything about seeing the people depicted, right? Like this example of Joe is like it's like a phone thing.
And I guess this gets plugged a bit more when you can speak to an LLM in much the same way that you would speak to a person. And in the end, if you're just communicating with language, does it matter that the other participant has personhood at all? If all that is really happening is like information, like transmissal. But I don't mean to bring LLMs too hard into this. I feel like there's enough here just in terms of like spatial understanding.
I wonder if Weiser's I wonder if he's really resting on this kind of shared space thing, this notion that Sal has like a copy of all of Joe's tabs and pads three-dimensionally correct. Like, is that the way that they're supposed to be more aware of the people on the other end of the link?
Try to be more aware based on like whatever shared context, since at the time this was written, you're not being able to do, anything like, volumetric video or anything like that, right? So you can't see or maybe, I guess maybe you could have, I'm not really sure about hearing, but being able to like have that just by the share, like, oh, they're looking at the same thing. So like there's the shared awareness, I guess is kind of what it sounds like he's getting at.
I wonder if he's making a comment kind of akin to one that Brett's made before, just about the way that screens have this kind of interpersonal view blocking characteristic. Like, so a vertical screen that's like in front of you has a very different effect on a social space than like a desk full of papers.
Hmm.
So this model does seem pretty um, agnostic about the orientation of any of these displays. It seems like
Yeah,
they're represented in every possible context, including ones that might actually be the same as just a conventional computer monitor.
that's right. Our vignette doesn't really give us a clear image of Sal's office. I mean, like, maybe if these pads are so cheap, like maybe the reason that we have these vertical screens primarily is that screens are expensive, and so we have to like design something that'll work for the most demanding circumstance, and we can use that all the time.
Yeah, I might be reading too much into it, but I do think the discussion of the different form factors does kind of align with form factors that are amenable to these more collaborative interpersonal uses. Like, it's clear that tabs are sort of supposed to, not tabs, pardon, pads. Pads are really supposed to play the role of paper, and boards are supposed to play the role of, whiteboards or blackboards, like large multi-person communication tools. So that part, I think it kind of gets right. But I do find it really striking, looking at this paper again, how these arguments aren't sort of made. It's all stuff that either Weiser was just lucky to sort of pick designs that I can make some post hoc arguments for in terms of interpersonal things, or these were all things that were going on implicitly in their design process that aren't really coming out in the paper. But it's like the way that I'm reading the paper now is that there all these sort of details about the specific hardware arrangement, this idea of having computation hardware spread out through an environment. That's really like the only concrete definition of ubiquitous computing that we can come away with from this paper with. And then there's some extremely high level goals, which are so high level, I would say that they don't even provide very good, they're not very opinionated. There are things like saying, oh, we want computation to disappear or become invisible, which is really just another way of saying we want it to be really well designed and not get in people's way, which is not really it's not really, there's not too much content there to really design around in my reading of it. So there's sort of a big missing middle. There's a big missing middle of like what are the opinionated values that are going into this.
One way to look at this is as a story, actually, of a failed hypothesis. So can we all check out figure 1? It's on page 2. Now, this would have been a crazy futuristic photo in 1991, right? So what do we see here? We see some tablets. It looks like there's 2 tablets in laps, and then the guy on the far left at 9 o'clock has some kind of like laptop-like thing. It's like kind of a propped up screen, and then there's a board kind of thing. And like really none of this would have been available to consumers. There would have been very primitive laptop kind of things in 1991, but they would have been extremely limited, like word processors, basically. And so in some sense, maybe one way we can parse what Weiser's saying is like, if only computers didn't need to be like these big, heavy things, had to be at a desk, we'd be free to interact with each other. Like, if only we had tablets and laptops and like digital whiteboards, then like the workplace would be so much more. And one way to react to that is to say like, well, we have all of those things now, and like actually, it didn't really do the trick. It's better. I remember when I was a kid, like we'd do LAN parties. Like I had my, you had your big desktop. If we wanted to do something together with our computers, one of us would have to lug the ATX mount over to the other person's home, and Now, if you're in an office with somebody, you might both pick up your laptops and go sit in a communal room.
I'm reminded a bit of like Steve Jobs's iPad introduction, where he decided to sit in an armchair, and this image might be the first example of someone propped up with one leg and another person in a beanbag, both partaking in computation. It's like one level more adult than sitting in the grass playing with your Dynabook.
We can see more in Figure 4 on page 6. So here we do get a little bit of the vision that Josh was gesturing at, with the idea of pads being like paper. Like a property of paper is that you can kind of like situate a piece of paper between two people, and like both people can kind of have a pen and write on it. And we're kind of seeing that in this figure. Like we see pens in both people's hands. There's actually real paper, it looks like, being like in the frame with the computers. Even today with an iPad pencil, like an iPad Pro, a big iPad Pro, like sharing one between two people is like not really a thing.
Just as a side note, it's so interesting to me looking at these these sort of situated tablets and seeing how much of the device is not the screen, which I'm guessing is you know, for the computation, you know, processing inside of it. But it looks like there's like, what's really also interesting, just observing these, is, I haven't looked at this in a while, it's just like the knobs and stuff at the top. It's fascinating. It's kind of interesting. It's like a feature of like, you know, imagine an iPad with like external physical things on top of it, which is like really hard to imagine.
Right. The funny thing is, like, these aren't even tablets that have their own computation. It says in the caption that these are wired to conventional.
Yes.
These are like external displays.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I almost feel like there's something, because they were developing this hardware and prototyping at Park, they had this kind of need or desire to put actual devices into these photographs that they're taking to show the vision, which really limits their ability to push on the vision. Like, you know, like in the first picture we were looking at, each person only has one big device. If they were just faking it, then they could have a million little scraps of paper around them. So they're just kind of stuck in a half-hearted representation of the vision.
They could have staged a version of the Sal scenario and done photos of it. I think that would have been cool.
But I mean, I imagine just politically, because they're actually showing off how they're making these things, they don't want to do that.
It was curious to me that the vision of the augmentation was like in the example where she had lost some manual, and it turns out that conveniently that manual had already been manufactured with the device in it preemptively. And it does seem to like very much the ubiquity requires that everyone's kind of bought in. And I think that the only power that like a true augmented reality, like head-mounted display or like digital eyewear or something, would actually give you the ability to like actually superimpose computation on anything, not just what has been like pre-decided to be computable.
Mm-hmm. So one of the elements of the current day world that is part of that vision, I think, and is missing from this Weiser paper is crazy computer vision capabilities, right? So what you're describing, this is possible because we no longer need tags to do anchoring in AR, which is crazy.
Or, yeah, like those little what are they called? What are they called? The fiducials, where they have like the sort of QR code like thing.
Now, what else is possible in a AR vision of the future, or in a pass-through VR vision of the future, which is not possible in Weiser's vision?
I want to clarify. So I think what I'm about to say is possible in Weiser's definition, but I'm curious, like specifically the live board, where you see a visual personalized to you. And I was thinking of the example of at airports, everyone looking at the departure and flights, and when your baggage is coming. I wish when I looked at that, I just saw just my flight info, and I wouldn't have to decipher between 500 flights. Is that implied in his vision? I think it was.
I don't think. Well, I mean that it could be implied in Weiser's vision. It depends on. In some versions of what you're describing, the board that's showing departure, it shows departure information for the people who are standing in front of it using cameras or whatever to figure out who those people are. And as people come and go, information comes and goes. And in other versions of that vision, because everybody has contact lenses that have for them, everybody, when they look at this board, which is in fact blank, they see the appropriate thing.
That was my interpret. Or okay, maybe that's the part I latched onto. Okay.
I don't think he's really suggesting that. And like my understanding of Weiser's aesthetic would be that he would not condone that kind of thing. He'd rather have the objects in the environment be displays than have like you have the display.
Right, like every physical thing is like some able to be computable or a display or something interacted with in some way, which is something, but like you touched on a second ago with like the computer vision stuff that we didn't have when this was written, and that was just like almost getting to the point where it's going to be taken for granted, right? Like
if you want to use information that's on paper, you still have to have your personal little camera pen with you at all times.
Yeah.
So it's not clear how volumes would work here. Like one of the affordances in the kind of Vision Pro design language is that applications can present not only windows, which we could approximate as pads or boards in this vision, but also volumes. So a region of space in which dynamic media are present, and that's a three-dimensional region. Maybe you could recover that in Weiser with holograms. It's not actually clear what volumes are for.
Right.
And even before we get to volumes, arguably we're not in a world now where you can buy 25 iPads. So that aspect of like, cheap spreading persistent displays around space is not yet really realizable, but something like Vision Pro gives you arbitrarily many spatialized displays.
Yeah, it does seem a very epicyclic model. Like we just have to keep on putting screens in places. We can't just like realize that we were Sol to begin with.
It's funny because like
that we were what? Sorry.
That we were that we were the sun and that we were the center.
Yeah,
okay.
It's funny because part of me also just wonder, like, I don't know, I guess kind of getting into the more, I get skipping forward a bit and, thinking about his like, writings on calm computing. It's been a while since I've looked at those, to be honest, but like, I can't help but imagine also like, if my memory serves me correctly, right, a lot of those was like sort of a screenless, screenless interfaces, right? Yeah. Like, calm being the sense of like, I can just interact with something with my voice or I think featured pretty prominently, right? Which that is getting closer. Or Siri and other assistants notwithstanding, right? Like, we are getting pretty good voice recognition. That's getting better and better and better. So
I think AirPods are a fascinating part of the present world that are not present in this vision. We all have basically ubiquitous, persistent, private, silent to others audio.
That reminds me a little bit of the silent speech interfaces that you wrote about.
Yeah.
Like, I guess you could consider that a form of ubiquitous computing in a way, right? You carry around this thing that you can have private conversations with someone at any time and
Gray, I
completely
really like.
private.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, I was done.
Gray, I really like your epicycles point because you can totally make it the other direction too. So like one of the things that was most shocking to me about the Apple Vision Pro was that, so I've worn a Quest 2, and the Quest 2, just as far as I can tell, does some fairly simple convolutions on the straight image data and then presents those images to the eyes. It doesn't have LiDAR. I don't think it's doing any kind of SLAM kind of craziness. And the Apple Vision Pro has kind of the same effect, roughly speaking, when you put it on. But the key difference is that, like, if you watch a film while wearing an Apple Vision Pro, then it like dims the light in your room. Requires it having like a simulation of the materials and the meshes in your room and the lighting model of your room. And it also casts emissive light from the film screen onto your suit and onto objects below the screen. Including like if you have a table, it'll like partially cast on the table and like partially cast on the floor. And so
And the
like
same
this
for
is
sound.
incredibly epicyclic, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah,
we've taken
especially. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead.
things.
Yeah, I was reminded too of when they talked about like um, simulating the audio dynamics of the room that you're in, which
Oh,
Christopher Nolan would probably not like that Tenet is being heard in my untreated living room. But it really does sound like it's coming from that location. It is interesting to me what parts of our normal like field of perception and like are like almost necessary for us to feel oriented and feel like there's some um, like shared like validity, or that like the same rule set is being applied to all of the objects that are being represented.
Mhm.
And when that breaks, then the objects seem like they're not participating, and they're dumber perhaps. But it does, yeah. I was hit by the same thing about just this like literalist like maximalism.
I think that the eyesight thing is very much of a piece with that, as are the personas.
Mhm.
It's almost a question about exactly how comfortable are people with being disembodied brains in vats receiving electric sense perceptions, or how much do we actually want to be in an environment, you know? Yeah, I mean, I think the epicyclic perspective on it is interesting, but it taken to its limit, it's like just stripping away, you know, all of these aspects of our actual experience in the world and our sensory experience, and just saying, oh, I just want the information, just feed it straight into my brain. So there's a spectrum there.
Yeah. And you're not even getting all of it. So I mean, one element that we haven't talked about here that is a real difference between the pads and the Vision Pro is tactility. So if you have a desk full of these pads, picking them up and moving around is a very different activity than moving around virtual windows.
yeah. Picking them up, tossing them, stacking them. Like, here is my stack of computable things, whatever they are. And, you know,
Yeah.
I'm done with them now and I can put them over here, but I can see them in my peripheral vision. And like,
Mhm.
versus have to put the thing on to think about it. Which I guess
I
is
think
kind of a
too.
nice separation, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and since they're just normal everyday objects, you can take them wherever, you can place them wherever, you can walk with them, you can attach them to your body, and there was a lot of desk talk in this paper, which makes sense, but it does sort of like, and Vision also very much leans in on like the user being static, and we're
Mhm.
still in this mode of shuffling objects around, and you have a lot more field of view to work with. But I have yet to see in their in their materials like anything like the luxury of having a studio large enough that you could have a separate area for each project,
Mhm.
so you don't have to have this like zero sum relationship with what window can fit in this area of my field of view before it will fade out because I put another window in front of it. And
Mhm.
you're almost like prevented from being a hoarder. You're like prevented from having this kind of rich layering of information that's like so important, I'd say. I was confused by. Oh, go ahead, please.
I was looking again at that photo of Stuart Brand and his shipping container that I had in my post on the Vision Pro. It's such an incredible photo, and I hadn't noticed that the paragraph above that photo talks about it being it's a 40-foot long shipping container. So he has 80 linear feet because he's using both walls, and that's really interesting. Like this means that all this material is not actually in his field of view at once. He has this space, like he can kind of have there be persistent locations for 80 linear feet worth of stuff. But I guess he has to be somewhat thoughtful about where that stuff is in space. And simultaneously, he can use proprioception and awareness as an adjunct to his reasoning.
Yeah, because he maintains a wide field of memory, like a field of environment instead of just the field of view. And if you're always having to reshuffle that based on the different set of apps that you're bringing up, or if I bring in a full space, I can't see any other app at all.
Yeah.
And like
I love that phrase, a wide field of memory. I really like that.
Yeah, one could imagine.
No, please.
I mean, I think the kind of spatial memory of the 40 linear feet on each wall is very powerful and important. And yet at the same time, like, is it actually necessary to physically walk 40 feet from the other? I'm not sure. Like, I can imagine having 40 linear feet in front behind me, and like having some, like being able to pick it up, you know, just translate right, and not losing track of it because it is still kind of still spatially coherent. Like stuff is still located relative to other stuff in a consistent fashion.
Yeah, and your actions to move it around are the thing that's grounding the reason why stuff would be moving around in your field of view. And like in a lot of my like VR locomotion research, like that's exactly what I found, that if you're moving yourself around with these tiny little like thumbstick movements, you won't feel good. But if you're like having to kind of like swim yourself around, that's more than sufficient to actually feel like you are locomoting and that you're moving around. And I think that's almost, I expect that to be table stakes in the next like decade, because I would hate for people to be so stasis-fied. There's probably a word for that.
I wonder if the Nintendo Wii team did research on the friction and like bowling and like try to simulate reality and how that impacted satisfaction or engagement. Sure, they did for gamification reasons, but because that's the example that came up. Bowling was too easy; I could just flick a wrist, or in tennis. But I wonder if I would have played more or would have enjoyed it more if it was represented closer to the movement. Because it's still pretty interesting, even as just like a simple wrist. Novelty eventually wore off, or I grew up, but it was pretty popular. Wii Sports.
I also imagine to create this, moving around the shipping container without standing up, you probably also need a wide sort of a wide field of view in some sense, because certainly like zoomable, panable interfaces on a computer don't come close to creating this sense of persistent spatial awareness.
I was drawn to this one quote on it's the page where it's page 4, I think, where he has the illustration of the active badge. Like in the bottom left paragraph, there's this quote about one way to think of pads is as an antidote to Windows, and how Windows were invented at Park to be able to fit a bunch of things at the same time on a computer screen. And it seems like books and pieces of paper and pads and tabs are exactly the same in that way of having an activity that's like very delimited, and you can see multiple activities at the same time, but not like an infinite number. And I don't see them different than windows really, and I wonder if I'm like misunderstanding his model of what a window is.
In 1991, you would have really struggled to have more than like two meaningful windows open on a computer at once. So Windows,
the resolution of this display.
yeah, like a typical display would probably have been 1024 by 768, right? Probably.
Still struggle to have more than two windows open on a screen at once.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good point that, like, you know, current desktop paradigms don't exactly encourage that, but like the role of the window was almost like state management. It's like you can have like a scroll position and like kind of an open document, whatever, kind of like preserved as you switch between active windows. Joshua, I wonder if I could pick on you to comment if you have any thoughts on just differences between this vision and kind of dynamic Landy visions.
Between Weiser's
Mhm.
vision. Yeah, I mean, I think when I read this for the first time, maybe like a year and a half ago, and I at first my first reaction was that I felt surprised actually at how much it did seem to relate to the dynamic land vision, and I think part of the reason for that is because up until actually reading this, I was aware of ubiquitous computing as a term, but only through the research that people do in academia under the label of UBComp. And that research has sort of little to do with this paper, actually. There's kind of, I think it generally tends to just be putting computers in more places, often with an aim of like Internet of Things type vibes, or often it's things like sensing in cities or sensing with the body as people move around their lives. Which has little to do with this. I mean, the way that I think about that is that sort of computation in the aid of the physical world, rather than this vision, which is more like the physical world in aid of computation. Or, I mean, maybe a better word than computation there would be like knowledge work or like, you know, sort of information. So yeah, I was surprised when I first read this at how it does start from that point of trying to take the computer, trying to take the small rectangle and unfold it into space. But I guess as we've been discussing this conversation, I feel like it doesn't really connect all the dots that I wish it would connect in terms of motivation, in terms of really focusing on, you know, how do you create computational media that help people work with each other rather than standing in the way between them, and how do you create computational media that allows people to you know, see the holes of systems, and you know, when you're working with parts of systems, to be able to understand how they fit into those holes and things like that. So, you know, because it doesn't connect those dots, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's easy to not take that set of lessons away from it, and instead to just focus on boards and pads and tabs and these more kind of specific hardware approaches. That's my like high level take.
Cool. I think it's interesting, for instance, that like there's no mention of any of the themes of malleability or end user computing here, right? Like the presumption here is that like a supplier is making all this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, and again, this sort of gets into what I was saying about how a lot of what it takes to be these goals of like calm computing or of computation that sort of disappears or things like that. It feels very orthogonal to me, to the particular hardware that's involved. I mean, it just putting things in a new form factor isn't going to fundamentally transform the way that you interact with it if it's just sort of the same existing paradigms of applications and the way that works. So yeah, so specifically what you're calling out, Andy, I think is a big deal. That in whenever I'm like trying to explain to somebody a couple sentences what dynamic land is, I usually like start by saying, oh, it's out there in the physical world, you know, pieces of paper, people around a table. But then I like very quickly need to also say, oh, and it's this thing that where the objects have the code on them, and using the system as an act of like reprogramming the system and making it do new things and combining things in new ways. Because without that, it's just, I mean, without that, it's, you know, I don't know, Hiroshi Ishii tangible computing kind of stuff.
All right, that seems like a great place to wrap it up. I have another a reading group to jump off to this time for some Shakespeare in a couple of minutes. So I'll take a brief breather. Thanks y'all for a really lovely discussion. This was super interesting, and I feel like I understand this paper a lot better now.
Thanks,
Likewise,
Andy.
thanks for introducing it to us.
Yeah.